Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 14th annual Kenneth J. Arrow Lecture. I'm Jan Svejnar. I'm the Richard and Gardner Professor of Economics and International Affairs at the School of International Public Affairs here. And we're very pleased the Center on Global Economic Governance that I lead here together with the program on economic research, Columbia University Press, and the Initiative for Policy Dialogue are very pleased to be organizing this event, which we do every year. In fact, this lecture was established in 2008 to honor the career and impact of arguably the most renowned PhD graduate in economics from Columbia. And the series continues to recognize and honor Ken Arrow, whose profound impact on the 20th century economics, philosophy, political science is widely recognized. And obviously we're honoring the speakers that come and speak here who are leading scholars in innovative economic research and scholarship. So we're very proud to continue this tradition in Ken's memory. Let me also recognize my fellow members of the Arrow Selection Committee, Joseph Stiglitz, Michael Woodford, Program Economics for Research Director David Weinstein, Miles Thompson, and major support from Joseph Shankman, Stefanie Schmidt-Grohe, and Harrison Hung. Okay. Now we are delighted, particularly delighted, to have with us this year Christopher Sims, who is the John J.F. Sherrerd 52 University Professor of Economics at Princeton University. He'll be delivering today's lecture, alongside with our discussants from Columbia University, who are Jennifer Lau, Joseph Stiglitz, and Michael Woodford. Now, it is our great honor today to welcome President Minouche Shafik, who will deliver the welcoming remarks. She is the 20th president of Columbia University and professor of international public affairs at the School of International Public Affairs here. She is, as you know, highly and widely respected economist, policymaker, and higher education leader who has spent over 3 decades in leadership roles across a range of prominent academic and international institutions. Just to select from her career from 2017 to 2023, she was president and vice chancellor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Before her tenure at LSE, she served as deputy governor of the Bank of England, where she led work, among other things, on fighting misconduct in financial markets. She was deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. This was during the turbulence surrounding the European debt crisis and Arab Spring. She was permanent secretary of the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, where she helped secure the UK's commitment to giving 0.7% of GDP in aid and focused on fighting poverty in the poorest countries in the world. She was the youngest ever vice president of the World Bank, where she worked on institution's first ever report on the environment, led work on infrastructure, private sector investment, and advised governments in post-communist Eastern Europe. President Shafik received her BA from University of Massachusetts Amherst. She had MSc from London School of Economics and DPhil from St. Anthony's College at Oxford. She holds a life peerage and membership in the House of Lords, a damehood for services to the global economy. I'm just selecting a few things here. And honorary fellowship of the British Academy, and a number of other honorary degrees. So please join me in welcoming President Shafik.
Thank you, Jan, for that exceedingly generous introduction. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today. This is my first academic engagement as the new president at Columbia. So. And I can't imagine a better occasion than to welcome you all to the 14th annual Kenneth Arrow Lecture. The lecture, as Jan said, was established to honor Ken Arrow, who was one of our most distinguished graduates in economics. And he was known as a gifted scholar, a skilled teacher, and a beloved mentor, whose work was foundational in shaping the discipline of economics, as well as in political science and political philosophy. Some of his most notable scholarly contributions include seminal theorems like general equilibrium, social choice, and endogenous growth that many of us grew up on. And many of his former students went on themselves to win Nobel Prizes, including our very own Joe Stiglitz, Eric Maskin, Michael Spence, and Roger Myerson. So we would definitely say he had a multiplier effect in the discipline. He shared the Nobel Prize in 1972 with John Hicks for their pioneering contributions to general equilibrium theory and welfare theory. And this series, in his honor, is meant to encourage and enable celebrated economists to explore groundbreaking ideas. And this series has also resulted in 9 impressive publications based on the research that was presented here. No pressure. But I can't think of anyone who better encapsulates the spirit of this series than Professor Christopher Sims. He, of course, has made significant contributions in the field of macroeconomics and developed important methods for analyzing the relationship between economics and policy. He, of course, won the Nobel Prize in 2011 alongside Thomas Sargent for their empirical research on cause and effect in the macroeconomy. And today he's going to speak to us about the origins of American inflation. As some of you know, and as was mentioned, I'm a former central banker, and so this topic is very dear to my heart. Central bankers are a very strange tribe. They can get excited about things like estimates of R star, which nobody has ever observed. They can get quite animated about the virtues and vices of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. And they would consider a meeting at the Bank for International Settlements in Basel far more fun than a weekend in Paris. But joking aside, the question of the origins of inflation is an intensely serious matter. During the so-called Great Moderation, we probably took low inflation a bit for granted. The COVID pandemic, the resulting fiscal stimulus, and the war in Ukraine, I think, shook our complacency because we suddenly had to deal with double-digit inflation for the first time in decades, and for many people in this room, probably the first time in your life, the question of having to deal with inflation, with huge consequences, of course, for especially those on low incomes. And in the United States, the debate about the causes of inflation has been intense and intensely political. Was it just a supply-side shock or the consequences of over-exuberant fiscal policy? I will let Professor Sims enlighten us on that question. But there are few macroeconomic questions more important for affecting the lives, the daily lives of people than this one. And I'm sure that Ken Arrow would approve of our choice of topic for today. So it's a real honor to have Professor Sims with us here today. And just while closing, I want to acknowledge all of those who helped organize this event. Columbia's Center on Global Economy and Governance at SIPA, the Program for Economic Research, Columbia University Press, and the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. And so I also wanted to recognize the faculty involved in all of those institutions and in organizing this series over many, many years. And I will now hand it back to Jan to introduce our guest speaker properly.
Thank you for those substantive and inspirational welcoming remarks, Minouche. And indeed, it's my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Christopher Sims. As I mentioned, he is a chair professor at Princeton University. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, member of the National Academy of Sciences, together with Thomas Sargent. As Minouche mentioned, he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2011. has focused on a number of aspects of macroeconomics, in particular determining the dynamic effects of economic policies on the macroeconomy. I won't go through the long list of contributions that he has made, but he has made indeed a number of contributions across the fields and various fields. I should mention that he served as president of two of the leading professional organizations, the Econometric Society in 1995, the American Economic Association in 2012. And indeed, he's truly in the mold of Kenneth Arrow and his contribution to economics. So let me welcome Chris to the podium. Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So I'm pleased and honored to be invited to give this talk. I didn't know Ken Arrow very well, but I met him a few times. I do have one story about him that is a little embarrassing for me, and but illustrates his matter-of-fact continuing work as an economist right up through the late decades of his life. We were at a Santa Fe Institute conference. I was there and had sat down and adjusted my chair to the proper height of the table. As those of you who are like me, over 80, realize that there's a tendency to get a little smaller over time at late ages. Ken came in and sat down in the seat next to me. He was about this high relative to me. And I said, "Oh, Ken, these chairs are adjustable." So he goes down under the table and fiddles with the thing, and he said, "It's already as high as it'll go." Smile. So with some economists, it might have been really embarrassing, but with him, it was, he didn't even notice. So now, on to the origins of inflation. There a clicker? Yeah, here's the clicker. So the motivation for the work that I'm going to describe is that we've been seeing things going on in the economy recently that are very big changes that have not occurred often in the past. And if we're going to get insight from history into the situations we're facing now, it seemed to me we need to pay more attention to a longer span of time. There's a tendency always to, if some variable is not available before 1970, you just forget about anything that happened before 1970 and fit your model. But that throws away a lot. The federal debt relative to GDP is at levels not seen since the end of World War II. This is a plot of the ratio of federal debt to GDP. If we went back a little bit farther, it would get back up to the height at the right at the very end of World War II. But you can see that there's a very low frequency, long, persistent pattern of movement here. And if you just concentrate on the last few years, you get a very unrepresentative sample of what's been going on. The ratio of the U.S. federal primary deficit to debt has recently been at levels not seen since the mid-1970s. Now, you may not recognize the mid-1970s as the center of deficit financing historically. Everybody knows Reagan ran big deficits in the 80s. The 70s, you don't think of it as being as deficit-ridden. And actually, we'll see when we get to that section of the talk that the opposite is true. And this depends partly on two things. One, using the primary deficit. The primary deficit is the difference between expenditures other than interest and revenues. You take the interest out, because once you do that, the primary surplus as a ratio to debt over time is the average rate of return to holders of debt. And so if holders of debt require a certain return, you've got to keep the primary surplus on average over long spans of time up to the required rate of return on government debt. So you can think of this ratio as as in the units of an interest rate or rate of return. And here's that chart over time. And you can see that in 1975, the ratio of the primary deficit to debt at a quarterly rate shot up to over 25%. It quickly came down the next couple of quarters, but it stayed higher than it had ever been since 1950 for a couple of years thereafter. This is so big for two reasons. One is that the level of debt was lower then, as we saw on that previous plot. So if you just looked at primary deficit by itself, it's bigger. These very recent numbers are bigger. But relative to the debt, the 1975 primary deficit was huge, and we haven't seen anything like it even yet. And then U.S. inflation, of course, you all know, has recently been at levels not seen since the mid-'70s and the 1950s. We don't talk that much about the 1950s, but the inflation around the Korean War in the 1950s was bigger than what we've been seeing recently, or than what we saw in 79, 80, in the late 70s and early 80s. So these are all reasons not to limit our attention to data for the last few decades. I'm going to skip that. So the one motive is, for what I've been doing, is a desire to look at a longer span of time. Another is to look at these data from the point of view of the fiscal theory of the price level. And I'll describe in a minute what that is. If you don't already know, my description of what it is may not be, may seem opaque, but we don't have time to go through the whole thing. There's a nice book by John Cochran that explains it in a lot of detail. So fiscal variables have been changing a lot in recent years. The models that are grouped under the heading of the fiscal theory of the price level suggest that big changes in fiscal variables could influence inflation. In fact, in some of these models, there's a sense in which they completely determine inflation. This paper looks for evidence in the data that mechanisms in the fiscal theory could be at work. I'm going to do this in two ways. One is I'm going to go through some historical episodes where inflation did interesting things and tell a story from the point of view of the fiscal theory about why this happened and how it happened. When I write this up, I'll probably give some attention to other ways of talking about where the inflation came from and how they integrate with or contradict the fiscal theory. But if I'm going to get through all this today, I'm not going to spend very much time. I'll talk a little bit about monetarism, but otherwise mostly skipping. There's a rich literature that explains inflation using the Phillips curve. And I'll have more to say in the write-up of this, but we're going to skip over that mostly today. So we're going to look for evidence. Well, this is not really evidence. You can tell a story about where the inflation is coming from the point of view of the fiscal theory. But one of the characteristics of the fiscal theory is that it insists that inflation is a general equilibrium phenomenon. So causal impulses that generate inflation don't all start in the same place. This is not like monetarism, which says inflation comes because something has happened to the money supply. You can look at this one-dimensional object over time and find out what the inflationary pressures are. And the fiscal theory, we'll see, tells us that inflationary impulses can come from many directions, and there's no single lever that can necessarily control them. So here's the simplest version of the fiscal theory. First line is the real government budget constraint that says that the real value of debt is the real interest rate on debt. Rho is the real interest rate. B is the real value of debt. The growth in the debt is the interest rate times the debt minus the inflation rate, because the inflation rate shrinks the real value, inflation shrinks the real value of the debt, minus tau, which is the primary surplus, the difference between expenditures net of interest and the revenue, difference between revenues and expenditures net of interest. Now, if you this condition labeled TVC says that the debt in the long run can't grow faster than the discount rate of the public. In other words, BT can grow, but not faster than e to the beta t, where beta is the discount rate of the public. Now, of course, this is a very simplified model. Everybody in the public is the same. They all have the same discount rate. And there would be a similar condition in a richer model. Once you apply this condition that people, it's really a condition that says people will not accumulate wealth at a rapid rate indefinitely without deciding that they should spend some of it. That's basically the intuition here. And though the fiscal theory models, the explicit ones, assume perfect foresight and rationality, what they're really relying on is the existence of wealth effects. This basic, which is what's behind this transversality condition. For rational agents, the transversality condition has a specific mathematical form. For ordinary people who are not calculating their lifetime expenditures and recalculating them every minute, you get the same effects you get from same qualitative pattern of effects you get from these rational agent fiscal theory models by recognizing wealth effects, recognizing that when there's a lot of debt out there and inflation shrinks it rapidly, that will make people feel less wealthy, and eventually it'll change their spending habits. But for now, we're going to stick with this notion that there's one kind of government debt, one real interest rate on the government debt, and there's this government budget constraint. And you can solve that government budget constraint forward to get this third equation, which says the real value of the debt is the discounted present value of future real primary surpluses plus a term that's the difference between the discount rate and the rate of return on debt. You can ask, why would the rate of return on debt be below the discount rate? Well, that comes from the fact that government debt tends to have a convenience yield. Government debt of a given maturity tends to have a lower rate of return than privately issued securities of the same general type. And this gives the government an ability to, it's a fiscal resource that there's this gap. So that it's not just the discounted present value of primary surpluses, there's also a discounted present value of this term that's a kind of seigniorage term, a privilege the government has of issuing debt at a lower rate than the discount rate. So then what we do to get a theory of the price level out of this is to rewrite this little b as capital B, nominal government debt divided by the price level, and then flip the equation around to read like the middle of this page. So P is on the left, and on the right, on the numerator is B, and the denominator is this discounted present value of future stuff. Now, it is true that if what's in the denominator stays constant, all the future primary surpluses, all the future seigniorage benefits, then if B increases, in other words, if a conventional deficit is run so that nominal debt goes up, this equation says, well, P has to go up in proportion. That sounds like monetarism all over again, but now with debt instead of money. But this theory, when you increase B, you are running a deficit. It's unreasonable to suppose that when people when the government increases the deficit, that people's beliefs about future fiscal policy remain unchanged. You'd think the natural thing is they run a big deficit, everybody's going to worry that there'll be more big deficits in the future. Actually, the conventional assumption in macro modeling, which allows you to avoid thinking much about fiscal policy and think only about monetary policy as determining inflation, is the view that when current deficits go up, that makes people believe that there will be smaller deficits in the future, not bigger deficits in the future. And it's true that there seem to be some historical periods in countries where that is true, but it's obviously not a necessary condition. And in fact, you might expect that there would be many places and countries and times when increased deficits today make people expect higher deficits in the future. So it's not a one-dimensional theory. You can have beliefs about future primary surpluses shifting. You can have the liquidity premium on government debt changing by a lot when there's a fiscal crisis, and that would change this beta minus rho B term. When you start trying to think about determinants of the price level and inflation in the fiscal theory framework, you've got lots of dimensions to think about. We'll argue when we talk about the Korean War, which in the next slide or two, that's an example where expectations about future fiscal policy underwent dramatic shifts over a short period of time when neither monetary nor fiscal policy was doing really anything by conventional measures. The expectations have just moved on their own and created a very substantial inflation. So now we're going to go through a few historical episodes and think about them from this fiscal theory point of view. So this is the Korean War. So World War II had been financed in good part by inflation, and there had been rationing. There's a nice paper by Lee Ohanian in the American Economic Review on the financing of wars, and it looks empirically at World War II. You can argue that it is optimal, that an optimal policy would involve some inflation in financing a war, because otherwise you may require extremely high and distortionary tax rates, and there's an equity argument that holders of government debt should pay part of the price of financing the war. So it's not that the World War II financing was obviously the wrong thing to do, though Harry Truman thought it was. He thought that it was wrong to have financed with inflation. But when the Korean War broke out, people apparently expected the financing of the war to follow the World War II pattern. People hoarded, people stocked up on stuff, commodity prices went up, and the inflation went very high for just a couple of years. Meanwhile, the political rhetoric was all about the importance of balancing the budget, and Truman proposed a big tax increase. The nominal value of the debt did not go up at all during the Korean War. Primary surpluses, there were primary surpluses all through the Korean War, no primary deficits. So there was quite a restrictive fiscal policy. It would be nice if the 2 years of inflation and the drop hadn't coincided with their passing a price control law, but they did. At about the same, you can argue it's about the same time it should have become clear to everybody that this war was not going to be financed with big deficits. When they were lifted at a couple of years later, when price controls were lifted, there was no burst of inflation, which suggests they were probably, at least by that point, not binding. So I would argue that this is an example that monetary policy was really doing nothing. Interest rates were stable. Fiscal policy was quite active, but in the direction of being contractionary. It looked like the inflation came because people expected, based on the World War II experience, that war was going to do this. And then when they realized that inflationary finance wasn't coming up, the inflation came back down very suddenly. So there was no movement along a Phillips curve. There was none of the fiscal theory, policy-controlled fiscal theory elements we talked about actually moved. It was just expectations that might in some sense have been rational, but were not correct. Rational expectations aren't always correct. They're just the best you could do based on current information. Maybe it was right to worry that despite their rhetoric, politicians would end up financing the war with deficits, but it turned out this wasn't true. And it's an important lesson for thinking about later episodes, including the current one. It can happen that inflation can change quickly and without any Phillips curve mechanism. Big shifts in expectations about fiscal policy can create inflation or end inflation without policy necessarily having to take big moves. Then in the 60s, Kennedy was elected. He appointed a Council of Economic Advisors that was kind of a all-star Keynesian crew, and they proposed as a counter-cyclical budget deficit, a tax cut. They knew they were creating a deficit by simple measures. There was a conventional deficit as they did this. The economy, though it had been in recession, was on the upswing. But they justified this as a counter-cyclical expansionary move. Then, after this was done, Vietnam War spending grew, and Johnson was advised by these same economists that with the big growth in expenditures, it would make sense to have some increase in taxes, and Johnson resisted that. There was a temporary tax surcharge at the end of the 60s, but it didn't cover all the spending, and inflation started to rise. As early as the 1960 election, Burns was explaining to Nixon about how without running deficits, they might have an inflation as the election date approached. Eisenhower resisted the advice to do fiscal expansion. In fact, in the text of this, I don't think I have it on the slides, there's a wonderful statement at a press conference by Eisenhower about the catastrophic results of running budget deficits. He like Truman, associated budget deficits with inflation. The reason for resisting budget deficits wasn't just some notion that the government budget is like a private budget and there's a moral imperative to pay off our debts. It was that deficits are associated with inflation. Once you get off on the track of running deficits, inflation is likely to snowball and it'll be catastrophic. It's a quite eloquent description of how terrible this would be in Eisenhower's comments. But what was happening in the 60s, starting with this Kennedy-Johnson tax cut, was the rhetoric was shifting. It became acceptable to talk about running deficits to counter the business cycle, to counter downturns in the business cycle. And as this rhetoric took off, and as Vietnam spending went up, the inflation rate began to rise in the late 60s. Then in the 70s, we have this dramatic embrace of deficits by the Republicans, who were supposed to be the anti-deficit crowd. Truman was anti-deficit, but not as strongly resistant to deficits as Eisenhower. So the two parties, when it was Truman versus Eisenhower, there was a difference in how strictly opposed to deficits they were, and it went in the direction of Republicans being the no-deficit party. But Nixon had learned the lesson of the 1960 election, and he famously publicly declared himself to be a Keynesian. Then after Nixon left office, or was run out of office, President Ford, another Republican, in 1975 pushed through the largest primary deficit as a fraction of total debt since 1950. It went to 27% at an annual rate in 1975, second quarter. That is, if they had kept that up for a full year, it would have increased the deficit by 25% in a year. So people who might be considering buying bonds and looking at what the returns were going to be, they saw these huge primary deficits. They saw them getting bigger, not smaller. They saw the Republicans doing them, even though the Democrats had started it back in the 60s. It's natural to suppose they were pessimistic about future primary surpluses, and that their pessimism was growing, and that this was a reason why inflation was getting worse. Arthur Burns is often accused of allowing inflation to rise through insufficiently aggressive monetary policy, but he did, in fact, move the Fed funds rate quickly in response to movements both up and down in inflation. Let's see if I have. The red line is the Fed funds rate. Black line is inflation measured by the personal consumption expenditure deflator. You can see that in the 70s, before 1980, there were two bursts of inflation. One right around 1970, where the interest rates shot up quite a lot more than inflation. One in the mid-70s, where the interest rate shot up kind of at the same rate as inflation. Now, what matters for whether whether an interest rate or whether a monetary policy that responds to inflation with interest rate movements is aggressive enough to keep inflation stable is whether in the long run, if inflation keeps going up, the interest rate goes up faster. But we don't know from this about that because the interest rate rises brought inflation down. And the interest rate then followed inflation down quickly. So we never see what would have happened if it had gone up faster under Burns. So you can think of what Burns was doing was raising interest when inflation went up, then following the prescription of the Taylor rule that you move the interest rate in proportion to inflation, he moved it down just as fast when inflation came down. But it didn't work. Inflation peaks kept getting higher. This is a pattern that's kind of expected in a fiscal theory model. I have a paper of my own called Stepping on a Rake, which has in it a Keynesian model in which you expect, in which when the monetary authority tightens interest, it raises the interest rate, it does cause inflation to go down, but then inflation comes back up as the interest rate comes back to normal, and it actually comes back up to a higher level than it was before the initial contraction. So you can easily, well, not easily maybe, you can write down a fiscal theory model in which just this kind of pattern is an unsurprising outcome. So you can think of this, a fiscal theory story about the 70s is the Keynesian conversion of the Republicans was frightening the bondholders, making them expect lower future primary surpluses. Arthur Burns was desperately trying to cut off the inflation, but every time he raised the interest rate and brought the inflation back down, it went back up higher. And the reason that was happening was that the fiscal background was shifting unfavorably. It wasn't his fault necessarily that the inflation kept going up so steadily. Now, of course, you can see after 1980, you see the effects of Volcker, which is pushing the constant term of the Phillips curve up, the level of the interest rate up, and shrinking the coefficient on inflation, because inflation was now coming back down, and he didn't track it down immediately and at the same rate the way Burns had. On the downside, he was slower to bring it down. So what about the 80s? In the 80s, inflation ended. It came down. It really didn't come down to what we now think of as a nice level of 2% for a while, but it came down from its double-digit levels down to 3 or 4% pretty quickly. The conventional story is that Arthur Burns was too weak with his monetary policy. The inflation got away from him. Volcker came in and pushed rates up high enough, and that did it. And furthermore, if you think about the fiscal theory of the price level, you're nuts, because as Volcker was doing this, Reagan was running huge deficits. So fiscal policy was expansionary, monetary policy was very contractionary. Monetary policy did it despite fiscal policy, as the monetarists would have it, proving that monetary policy can always control the price level, no matter what the fiscal authority does. But that isn't the right way to think about it. Reagan ran large conventional deficits in most years of his administration. Do I have that here? I hope so. maybe we'll come to it, but I left out a key graph, but I'll tell you the result, which is most years of his administration, he ran high conventional deficits that were high relative to historical precedent. But because the interest rate was so high, the primary deficit did not go up very high. In fact, the gap between the primary deficit and the conventional deficit that includes interest expense as an expense is larger than in this period of the Reagan administration than it is any other time in the 1950 to current period. And in fact, primary deficits were positive in most years of the Reagan administration, and they averaged plus 1.4%. Now, that may not have been high enough. The real rates of return on government debt were higher than that, so real debt did go up slowly during the Reagan administration. The debt-GDP ratio, at least the first part of the Reagan administration, the debt-GDP ratio did go up despite the primary surpluses, because the primary surpluses probably weren't quite big enough. But if you look at the average primary surpluses in the 70s, they were primary deficits in the 70s. They were big. And you got a sudden shift in 1980 to primary surpluses. If you look just at conventional deficits, you don't see this at all. But if you look at the primary deficits, it's perfectly natural that inflation ended or moved downward in the 1980s. And the explanation is tighter fiscal policy. So how does that happen? Alan Blinder's, whose book, History of Monetary and Fiscal Policy from 1950 to 2022, I've relied on that for the timeline all through here. And one of the, his discussion of the 80s starts out saying that once people saw the size of the Reagan deficits, all discussion of counter-cyclical deficits were off the policy menu. That there was policy debate about how fast to shrink the deficits, but the worry was the deficits. And that was because they were thinking in terms of conventional deficits. But the fact that they were thinking in terms of conventional deficits and began to be very concerned about balancing the budget was precisely what made the primary deficit go down. So there's another way to think about how this happened. The interest expense as a fraction of total revenues, which Congress sees when it's thinking about the budget. Interest expense blows up. They know that that's absorbing resources that they otherwise could allocate to their constituents. And that graph I do have. This is federal interest expense over federal receipts. In 1980, it had been growing ever since the 50s, over 3 decades. It had grown from 10 to 20%, but it was a fairly slow growth. In 1980, it suddenly started increasing at a higher rate and went up to over 25%, and stayed there for several years. So Congress couldn't ignore this. And also, seeing it happen and thinking about it makes you must have forced them to realize that if they didn't do anything, it was going to get worse. You don't control the deficit. The logic of compounding interest means this interest expense is going to get worse and worse, and they can understand that. They can understand it's absorbing resources that they don't get to allocate, and that it will get worse unless something is done. And in fact, something was done by the end of the 1980s. Congress imposed what were called pay-go rules on itself. They required that certain categories of expenditures, any proposal to increase expenditures or decrease taxes had to be balanced by a proposal to do the opposite. On the other, that is, if you decrease taxes, you had to say how you're going to decrease expenditures. If you increased expenditures, you had to say how you're going to increase taxes. Blinder points out that at the time, most people, including him, thought this was not a very important change. But in retrospect, both he and Janet Yellen have argued that this was actually a very important change. So what was happening in the 1980s was we went from everybody having learned that countercyclical deficits are okay and big ones are okay. Another theme that I didn't mention in these slides, I guess, is that the monetarists were there saying inflation is only a monetary phenomenon. If you want to stop inflation, do something to the money supply, and paying no attention to deficits. The old Truman and Eisenhower notion that deficits are connected to inflation. By the way, why did they believe that? There were all the examples of interwar inflation in Europe. The Sargent's classic book on the ends of hyperinflations emphasizes how the root of these high inflations was fiscal, and that ending them in every case required fiscal reform, and in fact was usually accompanied by expansion in the money supply as the inflation went down. So those people believed that, with some reason, that there was an association between deficits and inflation, based just on looking at history. At the end of the 1980s, some of that way of thinking about deficits had come back, and the result, and that's a way to explain how fiscal policy managed to become actually more restrictive in the Reagan years than it was in the 70s. Anybody timing me? 10 more minutes? So let me go quickly, because I don't have as much detail anyway, about the Great Financial Crisis. The Great Financial Crisis, from a fiscal theory point of view, the puzzle is you had a huge expansion of debt, no change in interest rates, no change in the price level. Something must have happened to the demand for debt. Well, it's this beta minus rho term. You had the financial crisis, the value of risk-free liquid debt to financial institutions shot way up. From the fiscal theory point of view, what was going on with policy was this increased demand for debt was being accommodated by the government. So you got a big expansion in debt, and it didn't create increased inflation because it was reacting to increased demand. The increased demand probably came partly because people just became aware that there were big risks they hadn't been thinking about it enough, but also because there were regulatory changes that made it valuable to have low-risk assets on your balance sheet because it would help satisfy the regulators. The zero lower bound period, the period when we were at almost zero interest rates and inflation was below target, this is actually an area where the fiscal theory literature has a very clear explanation. Probably the first big insight from fiscal theory in its early days was the point that a pure interest rate pegged by the monetary authority, if accompanied by a commitment to a fixed stream of primary surpluses, generates a stable equilibrium with a unique price level. In that equilibrium, changes in the primary surplus directly affect inflation. But if we see, so if you, in a situation where you're at the zero lower bound and stuck there and likely to stick there for a while, you're in this situation of an interest rate peg, essentially. And then inflation determination is a fiscal matter. If you're not able to achieve your target level of inflation, it's because you're running excessively large, excessively contractionary fiscal policy. And in fact, there's a classic early paper by Ben Habib, Schmidt-Groye, and Uribe, two-thirds of whom are in the audience, that showed that a conventional Taylor rule monetary policy accompanied by a passive enough fiscal policy could end up tending steadily towards just such an equilibrium with low inflation, low interest rates, and no tendency to get out of it. The pandemic and inflation, I think here there's an analogy with the literature and thinking on wartime finance. When there's a need for a large government expenditure as in a war or a pandemic or the Great Depression, as I've mentioned, it's arguably good policy to spread the financial burden across bondholders and future taxpayers. But doing this deliberately is difficult because it requires running deficits now, promising that these current deficits will not be financed by future taxes, so you can get the temporary inflation you want, while at the same time maintaining a credible commitment to long-run fiscal stability, which you need to do if you want to avoid this temporary inflation turning into a permanent inflation. Eric Leeper has a nice paper arguing that Roosevelt actually accomplished this for a period during the Depression by labeling a part of the budget as crisis-related and promising to balance only the rest of the budget. Francesco Bianchi and co-authors have some papers about exactly this kind of policy and the challenge of implementing it. Now, the Biden administration never promised to finance a pandemic part of the budget via inflation, but the inflation arrived and then started to fall, and it's possibly about the right size to achieve this kind of sharing of burden. The question is whether fiscal policy will evolve in such a way that inflation stabilizes at a moderate level. And there's a lot of uncertainty, needless to say, there's a lot of uncertainty now about the future of fiscal policy in the US. So now I only have a few minutes to talk about this complicated empirical model. So I'm going to go fairly fast. What I'm doing here is estimating a structural vector order regression. It's a model of a set of 8 time series. People have been doing a lot of this kind of model for the last few decades. What's new about this one relative to what's usually going on in central banks and academic monetary economics is that I've got 4 fiscal variables in the system: a monetary policy instrument, interest rate, a measure of financial stress. Well, I've got 4 fiscal variables, which are expenditures net of interest, interest expense, revenues, and debt, a monetary policy instrument, an interest rate, a measure of financial stress, real GDP, and the price level. So what's different about this is putting a lot of fiscal variables in. The motivation is, once you start thinking about this history from the point of view of the fiscal theory of the price level, it looks like each of these components can move in different directions. And if you want to ask, how is fiscal policy affecting inflation, it's a mistake to look to some kind of one-dimensional index of fiscal tightness that's kind of like a one-dimensional monetarist measure, and look to see how much that one-dimensional thing explains. So this is very multidimensional. It's a lot like factor analysis. The way I'm doing this, I'm assuming that there are a bunch of independent components shocking the system, and that at different historical periods, different ones of these shocks were important, had high variance. So what we're doing here is saying there are these independent, distinct sources of variation that show up as residuals or shocks in the model, and that when we go from one historical period to another, we find a different mix of shocks being important. If that's true, then these methods that I'm using will extract those independent sources of disturbance. I'm not going to go through the math. If you don't already know the math, there's not time to make you understand it. Half the audience probably knows the math. These are the variables: the ratio of primary deficit to debt, non-interest expenditures as a ratio to debt, interest expense as a ratio to debt. At some points I had a ratio to revenues, but I guess this is right for the results I'll show you. Debt, the nominal value of marketable debt, that is debt that can be traded in markets, the log of real GDP, the log of the GDP deflator, Federal Reserve discount rate. That's not a conventional monetary policy measure, but it does go back into the 1950s and was actually being used as a policy instrument in those times. The weakness of it is that in the 70s, there were a couple of periods where the discount rate didn't move at the same time as the federal funds rate. Most of the time, they move quite closely together. And then as a measure of financial market stress, the ratio, the spread between AAA and BAA bonds. And then to identify the model to make this whole thing work, we have to break history up into periods in which different shocks were important. And this list of dates shows the ends of the periods, which we could discuss, but there's no time. So here's the results. Now, what I'm going to try on the vertical axis, you get we can make this work. There we go. May not have time to do more than look at the PGDP row. But on the vertical axis, each row of plots is labeled with one of the variables. At the top, you just see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These are the 8 different sources of shock. One interesting thing to note is that there is one shock, the 7th one, which moves the discount rate a lot. And if you look, you can see it also pushes the price level down, it pushes the real GDP down. Each one of these little pots shows a response to a shock that occurs at the left margin. And so this discount rate shock, this discount rate by shock 7 is showing the response of the discount rate to this shock. It's the most important source of variation in the discount rate. It looks like a conventional monetary policy shock. It makes the inflation go down, it makes real GDP go down. But what's not so conventional about it is that when we look at the primary deficit, the primary deficit goes down by a statistically significant amount initially at the time this monetary policy shock hits. This is saying historically that the things that this VAR literature has identified as monetary policy shocks, shocks that make interest rates go up, inflation go down, output go down, tend to be accompanied by fiscal movements that are contractionary. So contractionary monetary policy is associated with contractionary, or at least initially contractionary fiscal policy. The other thing to see here is this shock, I think it's, shock 6. Shock 6 makes the primary deficit, the first row is primary deficit over debt. Shock 6 makes expected future primary deficits go up. Not so much the current primary deficit. This shock 6 is the main explainer. It's got a bigger response than any other shock for the price row. The main explainer of inflation in this model is a shock that doesn't have much to do with monetary policy, but has a lot to do with expected future primary surpluses. We could talk about there are more interesting things going on here, but I'm getting to the end of my time. And the point here is just to say, this is not the final answer on this. It's just the first step towards saying, let's open up our models to a richer array of fiscal variables and think about whether inflation policy about inflation has to integrate fiscal and monetary policy. This is just one step in that direction. In fact, what I hope to say is that this sort of semi-descriptive modeling of data will lead people to think about, is there a way to do an analog of a DSGE where you have more complete interpretation that captures some of what's going on in this loosely structured model?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. It was really very insightful, informative, dovetails very nicely on your earlier work on monetary policy actions of the Federal Reserve and the impact on inflation. So we now have three discussants who will present their views in response to this. The first one is Jennifer Lau, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics here at Columbia. She's also a Research Associate at the National Bureau for Economic Research, Research Fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. She's Associate Editor of the Journal of Political Economy, the American Economic Review, Insights, and the Review of Economic Dynamics. She's a macroeconomist with high theoretical orientation. She's written a number of path-breaking original papers in this area, and will be the first one to do the presentation. She will have slides, so she will come here. After that, we'll invite everybody to sit down and continue the discussion while seated. Jennifer.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that generous introduction, Jan, and it's an honor to be here and give this discussion of this paper. Okay, so what is the million-dollar question that all macroeconomists spend, their days thinking about, can't sleep at night thinking about? So that is, what determines the price level and inflation? And for those of you who are maybe not well-versed in the kind of intellectual history of this, I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. So The classical monetarist view is essentially that the growth rate of the money supply is really what determines inflation. This is where we get this famous quote that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon from Milton Friedman. In the late 80s, early 90s, issues were raised with this model, both theoretical and empirical. Essentially, empirically, we saw that measures of the money supply, so M1 and M2, were kind of largely divorced from inflation and other things going on in the macroeconomy. These issues led economists to move away from money supply as the primary determinant of the price level or inflation, and two frameworks or views or theories emerged. Okay, so what are these two frameworks? I'm going to kind of say that, divide these frameworks into two. One is the New Keynesian model, okay, and in this model, like the monetarist model, monetary policy still plays a very central role. Here the difference is monetary policy is specified in the form of the nominal interest rate, and inflation in this model, it's a micro-founded, fully specified general equilibrium model, but inflation of this model is determined, I put that in quotation marks because there are controversies around this, but inflation is determined not only by the monetary policy rule, but all other shocks in the economy, such as shocks to productivity, markups, demand in terms of preferences, monetary shocks, and the like. One thing that we learn from this model is that the money supply is largely unnecessary. This is what we call Woodford's cashless economy, and that you can really do monetary policy using the nominal interest rate. And the standard reference here is Mike Woodford's 2003 book, Interest and Prices. It's very aptly named because, as you can see, there's no money in the title. Okay. So I would call that maybe the more dominant or conventional view of inflation, and maybe Chris might disagree with me. The other view, a little bit more unconventional and potentially controversial since its inception, has been the fiscal theory of the price level. In this theory, at the very baseline version of this theory, the price level is really determined largely by fiscal variables, in particular this expected path of government surpluses. Monetary policy here can play a role, but it's a very kind of indirect or minor role. And the pioneering papers here were both Chris Sims's 94 paper and Mike Woodford's 94 paper. And now there was, this year in March, John Cochrane has kind of put all of his notes and articles together on this and also has now a book on the fiscal theory of the price level. Okay, so that brings us to today's lecture. So what does Chris do in this lecture? Well, basically he considers how much of the pattern of variation in inflation, fiscal variables, and monetary policy since 1950 can be understood through the framework of the fiscal theory of the price level. Okay, so what does Chris do in this paper? So there's two kind of main parts to this paper. So one is this historical analysis. Historians might hate me for calling it an informal storytelling analysis, but that's not a knock on what it is. I actually think this is very important type of work in which basically Chris goes through these episodes in U.S. history of high inflation and low inflation and tries to talk about them and give stories for them through the lens of the fiscal theory. Now, I think this is very important. I do think macroeconomists and our theories need to have a way of explaining what we've seen in historical episodes. There's another part of the paper in which Chris goes through a structural vector autoregression analysis. Now, this type of work, as many of you know, was pioneered by Chris, and this is also part of his Nobel Prize in 2011, in which he fits a structural VAR to a collection of macroeconomic time series. The main innovation here, and Chris talked about this, was basically he's introducing more fiscal variables than you typically see in any macro model. He identifies these shocks through heteroscedasticity, and in particular, he offers interpretations of these shocks through the fiscal theory. Okay, so what does he find? Generally, Chris finds that time variation in inflation is more closely associated with fiscal variables than with monetary variables. And he therefore provides suggestive evidence in favor of the fiscal theory of the price level. Okay, so what I'm going to do with the rest of my time in this discussion is for kind of give an overview of the basic fiscal theory of the price level framework. As Chris wasn't able to do that, I had rational expectations and correctly anticipated that I would be able to go through this framework, just the basic version. I'm going to talk a little bit about what distinguishes the fiscal theory from the new Keynesian or more monetarist view of inflation, and then conclude with whether this debate can be settled in the data. Okay, so the fiscal theory of the price level. All right, so the starting point, I'm going to start with the simplest version of this model, which is just suppose that the government can borrow by issuing one period nominal debt, okay, BT, at nominal interest rate IT. So here I've written up the time T government budget constraints. Okay, what is on the right-hand side? The right-hand side are inflows into the government's budget constraints. So basically the government collects taxes. PT is going to be the price level, so P times T will be nominal taxes, where T is going to be the real taxation that the government collects. It issues bonds at interest rate I, and then on the left-hand side of this equation are what the government's outflows. So basically the government spends, so that's going to be G. Again, that's in real terms, so P times G is going to be nominal government expenditures, and BT is going to be them paying back the bonds, okay? So this equation is not exotic at all, okay? This equation is in any reasonable macroeconomic model. By reasonable, I mean a micro-founded general equilibrium model with a government. It holds in the new Keynesian model as well as the FTPL, but the interpretations of it will be different, and I'll get to that later in this discussion. Okay. So now you can just rearrange that same equation. I've divided through by PT, okay, and then just rearranged it a little bit. And you can see that the left-hand side, which is the real value of the government debt, is going to be equal to the real primary fiscal surplus. So fiscal surplus is just taxes minus government spending, okay? So what the government kind of collected net of spending or expenditure this period, plus bond issuance. Okay, and then here I'm just going to define the real interest rate to be the nominal return on bonds over inflation, because you're basically getting a return on bonds in terms of dollars, but then in terms of goods, you need to divide by inflation. And then I'm just going to make a simple, make things more simple by just saying that the interest rate, the real interest rate is fixed, so that I don't have to keep track of those T plus ones. Okay, and then that equation becomes this equation here. And then what I do here now, what Chris did and what everyone does is you just iterate this forward. Okay, and you basically get this nice geometric series of the present discounted value of primary surpluses discounted at the interest rate. Unlike Chris's model here, I don't have any seniorage terms, so there's no convenience yield here. I'm forgetting about that. And then for the nerds in the audience, basically, of course, there's like that other term that could be explosive. Basically, you use the household's transversality condition to get rid of that other term. Okay? So now you can rewrite this, and this is the central equation of the fiscal theory, which essentially just says the left-hand side is this real value of government debt, and the right-hand side is the present value of the primary fiscal surpluses as of time t. All right? And so now let me just kind of interpret this equation and tell you about the implications. So in the FTPL, this equation is an equilibrium condition. So what does it mean? It means that the government chooses a path for primary surpluses, optimizing households who are going to hold that debt, choose how much government debt to hold, and it's really this market clearing mechanism that changes the price level. Basically, PT adjusts in order for this to hold with equality. Note here that basically what enters this equation is the real interest rate, not the nominal interest rate. So you can see that really monetary policy is not playing much of a role. It's really the main thing here is whether the government is running surpluses or deficits. Now, what's the interpretation or implications. So what Chris is doing in the data is he's looking at times where there's these changes in government surpluses and government deficits. So to understand what that means, basically consider an unexpected fall in the present value of primary surpluses. So basically think about like during the pandemic and after the pandemic, government spending increased, but without a commensurate increase in taxation. So if you believe that basically the government's not going to tax us more in the future, we have a fall on the right-hand side of this equation. So how do we get back to equality in this equation? Well, the FTPL tells us that in response, the price level must jump up. And the idea is now we're in this regime in which, we walk into this period in which the government, I realize that the government cannot pay me back in as many real goods as I previously thought. This leads to a re-evaluation of the government debt in which the real value of their debt must fall. When the real value of their debt must fall, what happens? Well, that there's got to be this increase in the price level. And that's what lowers this real value of government liabilities. Okay, so that's the FTPL, and that's what Chris goes through in the data. He looks at all of these kind of episodes in US history in which we've basically changed our expectations of what the future path of primary surpluses and primary deficits look like, and it's, that seems very natural. Now, one question is, this equation is derived from the intertemporal budget constraint, so it's a very natural and non-exotic equation, but I also said this equation is in basically every other model. It's also there in the new Keynesian model. So how is it that these two models can give us such different predictions on the primary determinants of inflation? Okay, so in my opinion, there's no inherent logic that explains these differences. The differences really lie in the interpretation of the budget constraints and who is in charge. Okay, so basically there's two more, so the interpretation of the government budget constraint is, so this holds in both models. In the monetarist and the new Keynesian model, the government budget constraint is really a constraint, okay? It's a constraint on fiscal policy. It basically says that taxes and expenditures must be set so that the right-hand side equals the left-hand side, no matter the value of P. So for any feasible or any conceivable price level. And in this model, the monetary policy is active. It follows its own decision rule. For example, in the new Keynesian model, it might be a Taylor rule. Whereas fiscal policy is passive, it accommodates the monetary authority by basically satisfying the government budget constraint. In the FTPL, this equation is understood to be an equilibrium condition. There's no inherent requirement that the fiscal authority treats this equation as a constraint. In this sense, the fiscal policy is active. It chooses its variables with no regard to this equation, and it's the market clearing mechanism that moves the nominal price in order to restore equality. And in this sense, the monetary policy is passive. Now, that's kind of a simplistic view of the FTPL because you can also have rules for the fiscal policy, but that's kind of like a simple way of understanding the differences between these models. Now, just to conclude, there are many models that incorporate both regimes. Okay, so for example, Chris mentioned this Lieber model. There's also the work by Stephanie and Martine, in which there can be two regimes. You can have an active fiscal and a passive monetary regime, or an active monetary or passive fiscal regime. Now the question is, can we distinguish these regimes in the data? Chris's paper does provide the suggestive evidence in favor of an active fiscal / passive monetary regime, or in favor of the FTPL. But obviously there's a lot of other work that provides evidence in favor of active monetary and passive fiscal. Furthermore, even in active monetary and passive fiscal regimes, as soon as you kind of kill Ricardian equivalence, you can also get fiscal shocks that can have macro effects. So it doesn't necessarily lead to active fiscal and passive monetary. Finally, just to say, generally, it's very difficult to develop testable restrictions in the data that allow us to distinguish between the two. There are papers that kind of make this argument. And why is that? Well, again, as I said, the same equations are in all of these papers. So basically, even if the equations are the same, the causality runs in opposing directions. So in order to kind of believe your model, you really have to believe your identification in your empirical strategy. Okay, but in any case, while I am still skeptical on whether, is this the last word on the FTPL, I agree with Chris, I don't think it is. In any case, I do welcome the new evidence and historical analysis that's brought to the table with this paper, especially thinking about other fiscal variables. And I hope that opens up a lot more room for new work on this topic.
Well, it's a pleasure to introduce the second discussant, who is Michael Woodford. He is the John Bass Clark Professor of Political Economy and Chair of the Economics Department here at Columbia. He has written a number of fundamental path-breaking articles. I should mention that he received the Publisher Award for Best Professional Scholarly Book in Economics for his 2003 book, treatise entitled Interests and Prices, Foundations of a Theory of Monetary Policy. He has written and edited, co-edited number of important volumes. Let me just mention the 3-volume Handbook of Macroeconomics with John Taylor, 2-volume Handbook of Monetary Economics with Van Friedman, Inflation, Targeting Debate with Dan Bernanke, and the textbook International Macroeconomics with Stephanie Schmidt-Roy and Martin Riebeck, who are here also. His current research focuses on implications of bounded rationality for economic analysis, and he draws on findings in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. So, Mike, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It's a pleasure to be invited to comment on this this very stimulating and provocative talk, and I'm looking forward to seeing the book that I hope is going to come out of it. I strongly agree with a number of important things that Chris is trying to do here. One is simply his argument at the beginning that economists ought to talk more about economic history. I think it's, in fact, a big shame that economic history has dropped out of the economics curriculum to a large extent in graduate programs in economics, and it's something that actually economists would do well to learn more about. I think that's particularly true for macroeconomics, the kind of topics that Chris was just talking about. And the reason it's so valuable for macroeconomics in particular is that in macroeconomics, one is concerned with understanding what's going on in the economy as a whole, and therefore very complex phenomena with many things happening at once and everything affecting everything else. And it's difficult just looking at what's going on right now to understand how to disentangle causality from all the many things that are changing simultaneously, and having a variety of different episodes that one can think about under very different circumstances, I think can help one to understand more. And when I say economic history is valuable, I think it doesn't just mean, well, having longer time series means we can estimate things better, but actually narrative history. I mean, not just having a set of time series and seeing how they co-move with each other, but having more of an understanding of what was actually happening at different points in time in a richer way, knowing more about institutional context, what people were saying, what at least some people were thinking as things happened, is actually very valuable for trying to disentangle causality. Turning, and I think Chris's talk gave you an idea of the extent to which it is important and also complex to try to disentangle those kinds of questions. In terms of the more substantive theses, that Chris has been advancing, I think he's surely right that fiscal developments have been crucial for understanding the path of U.S. inflation since 1950. And in particular, I think if you ask what are the three most notable periods over that time when inflation increased notably, I mean, that would be the Korean War, the great inflation of the 1970s, beginning in the second half of the 1960s, and then the recent inflation surge following the pandemic. I think in all three of those cases, it's quite plausible to argue that at least this departure of inflation from previous low levels was triggered to an important degree by fiscal developments. In the early 1950s, it was surely the outbreak of war and a sudden ramp up of military spending that was crucial in triggering those changes. In the case of the great inflation, I think Chris is right to mention, at least as how it began, that it began because of the Johnson administration's desire to fight a war in Vietnam and not increase taxes because the war was unpopular enough without making people think you also had to pay for it. And in the most recent episode, there were large fiscal transfers in response to the pandemic, and that's surely at least part of the important causal factors in then the surge in inflation that if it occurs later. Nonetheless, so I would very much endorse the view that we ought to be, in thinking about inflation and trying to model it, be putting fiscal variables into our models and understanding a lot about fiscal developments. I think there are two important qualifications that are necessary to the story that Chris was telling in the lecture. First, I think that admitting that fiscal developments are important doesn't mean that changes in monetary policy didn't also play a central role in the history of inflation over the last several decades. And I think Chris was downplaying the importance of monetary policy and monetary policy changes relative to the way I would have told those stories. And secondly, admitting that fiscal developments had important consequences for inflation doesn't necessarily mean that one can best understand the effects of those fiscal developments through the lens of the fiscal theory of the price level, as Chris was proposing. So first, on the point about monetary policy, as an example, in explaining the high inflation of the 1970s, Chris emphasizes the existence of larger primary deficits in that period, and he downplays the significance of Fed policy under Chairman Arthur Burns. He says that Burns did move the federal funds rate quickly in response to movements in inflation, and suggests that Burns was tightening policy in response to inflation, that maybe the failure of these monetary policy tightenings to stop inflation from going up was due to the stance of fiscal policy. Now, I would agree that fiscal policy did become quite expansionary for reasons that Chris was discussing, and I would not at all deny the expansionary impulses coming from fiscal policy, things like that notable fiscal shock in the Ford administration and so on. I think the exculpation of Arthur Burns and the Fed and the role of monetary policy goes way too far. I guess we can't bring back Chris's slides, or I would like to look again at that figure relating the federal funds rate to inflation, but
Keep going, and we'll try to get it
okay.
back there.
So so Chris said that the Fed did. He said that Arthur Burns did increase the federal funds rate sharply up and down in response to variations in inflation. And the first of those big swings, and the only one that was big relative to the amount of the change in inflation, was a big peak up and then down in the federal funds rate, which peaks around 1970. Okay, yeah. Okay, so you see the first hump there, which is associated with inflation having become higher in the late 60s, and it looks like the federal funds rate goes up even more than inflation has gone up. Now, what I would point out about this is there's a change in who's running the Fed in February of 1970. So under the previous chairman, William McChesney Martin, he followed a policy that was very much trying to resist this increase in inflation, although the Fed doesn't stop inflation from going up. In the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson was very unhappy with him about this and tried hard to lean on him. He called William McChesney Martin to his ranch in Texas in 1966 and said, Martin, my boys are dying in Vietnam and you're not printing the money that I need. Okay, but Martin, held stuck to his guns. He insisted that the Fed did need to try to fight inflation. That caused a credit crunch later in 1966. And as you see in the late 60s there, 1969 in particular, the federal funds rate goes up really sharply. February 1970, the Fed is handed over to Arthur Burns, who was the buddy of Richard Nixon, who appointed him. You see what happens to the federal funds rate when Burns comes in. It falls by about 5 percentage points there. There's a really sharp fall, and not because inflation has come down. If you look in the late 60s through the early 70s, inflation is wobbling around at this high level, very high relative to the previous couple of decades. Burns switches directions of monetary policy very dramatically, bringing the federal funds rate down. What's going on? Well, I would say what's going on is clearly he's willing to play ball with Nixon and shift to a very expansionary monetary policy to try to ensure that there won't be any threat to Nixon's being reelected in 1972. You say, do we know it? Well, in the White House tapes, conversations that were expected to be private at the time, but in fact became public, we find Arthur Burns conferring with Nixon and agreeing that they're going to use Fed policy to goose the economy to make sure there's no threat to the re-election. And Nixon tells Burns, kick him in the rump, is what he says he should do with the other members of the FOMC, and Burns agrees that he's going to do that. Okay, later, when inflation does surge even further, after the 1973 oil shock and then the relaxation of the wage and price controls that are finished by 1974, you see inflation shoots up quite a lot. And at this point, the Fed is allowing, Nixon is reelected by then, the Fed is allowing nominal interest rates then to go up sharply, but they only go up the same amount as the inflation rate has gone up. So real short-term interest rates do not in fact rise, despite the fact that inflation is now getting really out of control. And so saying that the Fed is pursuing contractionary policy in response to inflation, I think is not actually how I would read the story of what's happening there. Now, when we go on to the 1980s and explaining the important disinflation that occurs in the 1980s, I think Chris downplays more than I would the role of the dramatic shift in monetary policy under Chairman Paul Volcker, who comes in late in 1979. And he instead attributes the disinflation to a shift from high and rising primary deficits in the 1970s to a period of primary surpluses in the 1980s. But I don't think this was due to a change in ideas about the acceptability of budget deficits in Washington that would have occurred without the change in Fed policy. If you ask how did ideas about fiscal policy and expectations about fiscal policy change around the beginning of the 1980s, of course, Ronald Reagan was elected president. One of the signature issues that he ran on in his campaign was the promise to cut taxes and to cut taxes sharply. not just to cut taxes, but his advisors argued that it was not necessary to pay for the tax cuts by raising revenues in some other way or by cutting spending immediately. They argued that the tax cuts would probably pay for themselves by stimulating the economy enough that that government revenues would not actually fall. They argued that it was important to make the tax cuts permanent because their theory was not that we want to cut taxes to put money in people's pockets, do something as Keynesians might have argued, but to provide supply-side incentives and to provide these incentives for further investment and productive activity, it was important to create the expectation that taxes were going to be low in the future. And so if you ask what kind of expectations about fiscal policy people should have had given this dramatic change in the political economy of the U.S., I think you would have thought that this was a shift toward more expectation of toleration or perhaps even promising lower primary surpluses off into the future. And indeed, what happens is the federal deficit does balloon. The conventional deficit particularly went up to levels as a share of GDP higher than had been seen since the end of World War II. But it was not just the conventional deficit. The primary deficits also become positive during the first Reagan administration. Chris referred to there being a positive primary surplus on average over the Reagan administration, but that I'm pretty sure because you're talking about primary surpluses during the second Reagan administration. Your figure shows the positive deficits during the first Reagan administration.
There were some positive deficits, but you average the deficits and surpluses, you get surpluses at 1.4% over the two Reagan administrations. It would be much bigger.
The second one, that was one, yes. So in any event, I mean, I think that I find it unpersuasive that the reason inflation comes down is because fiscal policy expectations shifted exogenously in a way that would favor disinflation. It's true that later in the 1980s, starting in the second Reagan administration and even more in the 1990s, policymakers did become more concerned with bringing the government budget under control, but this seems most likely a response to the shift in monetary policy that occurred in the early 1980s. And this isn't entirely contrary, of course, to what Chris was drawing attention to, because he talked a lot about how the fact that monetary policy had become tight led to this big increase in the burden of interest on the public debt, and that was what then had a lot to do with driving fiscal policymakers to actually reduce those primary deficits. And I agree with all of that. And of course, I agree that studying what was going on with fiscal policy is important. But I think it's plausible to think that the shift away from large primary deficits only occurs because of the change in monetary policy regime that has occurred. I think if we had had someone like Arthur Burns still running the Fed, there would have been no reason for this this shift away from running consistent primary deficits. And so I would attribute the change to a great deal of importance to the change in monetary policy under Volcker, the fact that inflation was able to come down. So I probably used up all of my time. I'll just say very briefly, recognizing that fiscal developments were important doesn't necessarily mean that U.S. inflation history is best understood using the fiscal theory of the price level. And the reason I would say that is something Jen mentioned also briefly, which is that there are many other reasons why you can have macro models where fiscal policy has effects on inflation that don't depend on that mechanism. There has to be some reason why Ricardian equivalence isn't true. If you maintain all of the theoretical assumptions that would then imply Ricardian equivalence, this would imply that fiscal transfers, increases in the public debt, shouldn't have any effect on spending in the economy, on interest rates, on prices and so on. But there's a whole set of fairly strong assumptions that are needed for that to be a theorem. The fiscal theory that Chris was proposing modifies one of those assumptions, the assumption about whether people expect increases in the public debt to be immediately associated with an expectation of surpluses later to service that debt, and leaves in place the other assumptions that the Ricardian theory, so the representative household model, the assumption that there are no financial frictions, the assumption that people all correctly understand the future consequences of current shocks and current policy changes and so on. And if you instead modify those other assumptions, you introduce reasons for fiscal policy to be able to affect inflation without having to go through the particular mechanism that Chris was talking about. But I think I'll stop with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Yeah. As we go from one discussant to another, we have a slight rise in the friendly controversy. Presenter. Now that brings us to Joe Stiglitz, who is the third panelist. Let me just very briefly say Joe is the university professor at Columbia. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute, was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001, and the John Bakes Clark Medal in 1979. The author of hundreds of articles, numerous books. Let me just mention most recently the books People, Power, and Profits, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, and Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited. Now, there are a number of stories and legends about Joe Stiglitz. I'll mention very briefly just one. He was extremely precautious, sort of moving through the schooling very fast. So when he was considered for tenure as a very young man, there was a problem because letters were coming from external economists. A letter came from, at that time, the most notable economist, Paul Samuelson, which was very short. It said, give him tenure, he is the best economist from Gary, Indiana. There caused some uproar at the time because these letters are seriously taken by the deans, provosts, the presidents of the university. So they were wondering what was going on, and after considerable search and investigation, they found out that Samuelson was from Gary, Indiana. So it's your turn.
Thank you. And let me first thank Chris for coming here and giving a wonderful lecture in honor and memory of Kenneth, who was one of my teachers when he was a visitor at MIT and a long time colleague when I was at both at Stanford and at various places where I was. One of the reasons we want to honor Kenneth is we want to remind our students what a good PhD thesis is like, and set the standard. And his PhD thesis was social choice and individual values, which is one of the classic books in welfare economics. So that's what you should aspire to for your PhD thesis, not just a little wrinkle in somebody else's model. Previous discussings have brought out a number of issues, and I'm going to both reiterate a couple of them, but also take a slightly different tack. The issue of inflation is very much at the fore because of the high inflation that Chris referred to in the post-pandemic era, and trying to understand the sources of the inflation are really important. I think Chris is absolutely right, in the previous discussion, you're absolutely right. You have to look at inflation within a general equilibrium model and intertemporal model, and you have to expectations play a very important role. in that kind of complex, infinite number of periods, infinite number of goods, fiscal and monetary policy, it's very difficult to identify what are exogenous, what are endogenous variables, what determining causality is really difficult, and I share Jennifer's pessimism that we can do it definitively. But I think that trying to do the best you can, including looking at history, is very important. But once you start looking at history, you get, there's a little bit of history in macro is a little different from history in the rest of the world. Because if you were talking about history of inflation in the 70s, the word that would come to fore, which is only mentioned once in this discussion, is the oil shocks. That's a micro shock. And I'm going to come a little bit to talk more about the pandemic is a micro shock. And, I think we have data both on expectations, on individual firm expectations of a whole set of variables, not all the variables we like and not as precisely defined, but we do have some data on expectations. And we have lots of microeconomic data on the components of the price index. So we don't have to just rely on that aggregate. We can try to look at what's driving the aggregate. And I think when we do that, we get an even more complex picture than and maybe even more uncertain picture. I feel very, particularly in the current context, that there's been over-reliance on unstable macroeconomic aggregates. So I'm approaching this maybe as a macroeconomic skeptic, that in particular, there were statements by some macroeconomists. I'm not sure what tradition they're in, but policy macroeconomists who tend to not to be in any tradition, but like Larry Summers said that it would take 10 years of high unemployment using a Phillips curve framework to get inflation down. And it took, 2 years of unemployment at lower than 4%, and inflation came down. And to me, that was not a surprise, because inflation was not either a fiscal or a monetary phenomenon. Now, if you didn't look at the microeconomic, if you didn't look, more detail, you might have said, oh, the fiscal is really out of kilter. We know what happened to the primary deficit or any deficit, government spending. And there were people who put the center of the problem at particularly Biden's American Recovery Act, which was very large. And, in retrospect, probably larger than was needed, but you have to remember there was a lot of uncertainty at the time, and there are asymmetries of consequences, and you didn't want people to die or have other disasters. So you could say it might have been a reasonable policy, but still have ex post strong inflationary consequences. But if you look at what people did with the money that got, a very significant fraction of the population just held on to it. So cash balances went way up, and and savings rates were abnormally high. The savings consumption function shifted. for obvious reasons, and some of the stories that Chris talks about illustrate there's an increase of uncertainty. And in the presence of particularly the extreme uncertainty of, sometimes called radical uncertainty. You didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. You didn't know how the economy was going to respond to, or the government, to events the nature of which we had not ever seen before. It is natural that people would take a precautionary approach, and firms would take a precautionary approach. And so the shift in both the consumption function, investment function, is not a surprise. But you see it in the data. And what you see very clearly, if you look at aggregate demand, it remained below the economy's potential output, well below what was forecast before the pandemic. So it's very hard to see this as caused by either excess aggregate demand or the deficit, the primary deficit. You look at the timing of and the components of inflation. In the beginning, the most important component, about a third of inflation, was explained by by car prices. And it wasn't that we didn't know how to produce cars. It was only that they forgot to order chips. And there was a misjudgment about how long it would take to remedy that and a host of other supply side interruptions. But I think overall we were more optimistic about how well our economy functions. And the market economy didn't function quite as well as we had hoped for a whole variety of reasons. But that was at least one part of that. Another aspect that was, again, a shock that was were shifts in the pattern of demand, and people wanted different goods, and so, but again, pandemic and fairly temporary. So one example is housing. We killed off more than 1 million Americans, and nobody wanted to come into the United States, and we didn't want them to come in. So the net result of this was, in a normal model, you kill off 1 million people, the demand for housing would have gone down. Any model with housing and the number of people. Well, it didn't. The price went way up. Why? Because with the pandemic, New York was not as attractive as it is normally. It's now coming back. And they wanted to live in Southampton and Hudson Valley, and there were only a fixed number of houses there. And so prices went up. And the asymmetries in responses to excess demand and excess supply meant that the housing index went up way up, and that's more than 30% of the CPI. Not so much in the PC, but the point I'm trying to make is that the way we construct these indices and the way the inflation can be really very closely linked to these microeconomic phenomena, and looking at the macroeconomics may lead you not to the right policy conclusions. The interpretation that I've just given is also consistent with data on expectations. If you, because we now have because we have inflation adjusted bonds, we can look at, there are ways we can find not only surveys, but other ways we estimate inflationary expectations in the market. And And inflation expectations didn't go up. You might have said, looking at these deficits, we ought to expect more inflation. And I think they didn't go up because I think most market participants' interpretation of what was going on was a little bit similar to what I've just put forward. They thought this was a temporary shock. They didn't know how temporary, and so it did creep in a little bit, but it didn't go up anywhere near as much as it would have if you had taken to any theory based on either the fiscal side, the magnitude of, or even the monetary, the expansion of the monetary base. So the final point I want to make is that just like we're trying to parse out the relative importance of monetary and fiscal, I think it's really important to think about not all fiscal is the same, and the multipliers or the effects of fiscal are different fiscal policies are differing. So that, for instance, fiscal spending, if you thought that one of the problems of inflation was a shortage of labor, then the fiscal response of having more child care, which would have led to a significant increase in the labor supply, would have probably on the supply side far more effect than on the aggregate demand, than the increase in the primary deficit. So once you put it in a general equilibrium, you realize that there are income and substitution effects going in all kinds of ways, and that policy can be actually more fine-tuned than just talking about big aggregates, money and monetary policy, fiscal policy. We can try to, when we have a supply-side shock of the kind that we've had, try to fine-tune it a little bit more, and I think do better. And then finally, let me just reiterate the point that Jennifer made, which I think is crucial. When we're thinking about inflation, is thinking about how are prices determined. Are they determined, and I think of prices being determined in a very decentralized way by different firms in our economy. It's not an auction market, it's prices. And so understanding the price setting function, the price setting of firms is really central. So I look at it more beginning at inflation. How do firms set prices? Well, where this is particularly important is, again, the pandemic illustrates market power can shift very strongly. And in the pandemic, there is strong evidence that there was a marked increase in perceived market power, partly because the supply side interruptions meant that the normal competitive pressures were markedly reduced. And markups went up. Prices went up more than could be justified by cost. And this is important because the Fed right now is saying we want to increase unemployment, to increase workers' suffering as a matter of public policy. I find that strange that a public official would say, I want to increase suffering. But the argument is that it is the only way to bring down inflation. And if you believe that wage increases need not be passed on to price increases because we had a temporary large increase in markup. Now that we're restoring ourselves to a more competitive economy, we can get those markups down, and we might have more effective antitrust policy or other things to try to get those markups down. Then we can restore wages, real wages, to what they were rather than making workers having lower wages. Inflation is not just a change in the yardstick, and in the interim, there are people who are suffering. I was asked by, I don't know if I should I was asked by the postdocs and the others who are in negotiations with Columbia. Your first public, but it is part of the context. Inflation affects everybody, and they have emphasized that their wages have not kept up at all. The wages, their stipends, or whatever you call them, have not kept up with the cost of living, and that their current compensation is below a livable level for New York City. But anyway, this all illustrates that understanding inflationary processes are important, and that I think it's important to look at the microeconomics as well as the macro.
Thank you, Joe. I've been a little bit too lenient, so I take the blame, but we definitely have to let Chris have a few minutes to respond, so please bear with us.
Okay, so let me start with Jennifer's first point, which is an important mistake. The notion that the difference between the fiscal theory and the usual DSGE theory of determination of the price level is a matter of whether what the quote intertemporal government budget constraint is a constraint or not. Is fundamental. Jen started by explaining how price level determination can be thought of as market clearing by movement of a price. In this case, we're taking what she was calling the intertemporal budget constraint, which many people call it that, is an equilibrium condition. It describes balancing of demand for government debt against the supply of government debt. Saying that this equilibrium condition, which is derived not from any accounting identity or physical constraint on the government by itself, it's derived from the combination of the current budget constraint, which is a real constraint, with this transversality condition that is an equilibrium condition of the private sector. Saying that you're going to treat that equilibrium condition, as a constraint is like saying when you derive the supply curve of a firm, that they have to recognize that they can never actually sell anything that's not on the demand curve. And so it's a constraint on the suppliers, that the demand curve is a constraint on the suppliers. It's really that fundamental a misconception. The difference between the DSGE approach and the fiscal theory approach is the assumption that there is something automatic about the behavior of the fiscal authorities, that it must react in such a way as to let monetary policy determine the price level all by itself. But that's patently not true. We know examples historically. For example, when we look at Latin American inflation, one of Mike's students, Loyo, has a discussion of Brazilian inflation in which he describes how the monetary authority realizes that even though the inflation rate is above the interest rate, and standard monetary policy prescriptions would say you have to get that rate above the inflation rate, they recognize that because the fiscal system was so gummed up in Brazil at the time, that the rising in interest rate would only feed through the government budget into a more rapid rate of increase in nominal debt, and would reinforce rather than cut inflation. Of course, if there had been an appropriate fiscal response, as there was after Volcker's rapid rise in the interest rate, the outcome would have been different. I wouldn't at all deny that Volcker's bold actions of pushing the interest rate way up and keeping it up higher than standard Taylor rule prescriptions would have seemed to imply was very important in bringing inflation down. But I don't think it would have worked if it hadn't succeeded in making the fiscal authorities in the U.S. react in the way they did. If he had done that in the Brazilian 1960s context, it wouldn't have worked. And recognizing that is the most important insight from the fiscal theory, that monetary policy always requires fiscal backing. Sometimes, in some countries, in some places, the fiscal backing is so understood, so automatic, so institutionally built in that we don't have to think about it very much. But it's always fundamentally true that monetary policy that doesn't get an appropriate fiscal reaction will not have the usual or intended effects. On Joe's remarks, I wouldn't at all deny that it's very productive to look at the microeconomic complexities of inflation, and that one's conclusions about the effects of a given monetary or fiscal policy intervention could vary depending on the specifics of the current microeconomic situation. The oil shock, by the way, is in the part of the discussion that I skipped over the paper, or skipped over completely in the slides. I am going to discuss the Phillips curve and how it broke down in the 70s. People who believed in the Phillips curve, and many of them still do, saw the breakdown as due to the oil shocks. Oil shocks explained why why the Phillips curve stopped working. But Alan Blinder, who actually is in this school that believes that it was the oil shocks, does point out that people have ignored the fact that food inflation also shot up slightly before the oil shock. And that raises the question, why was it anticipating the oil shock? Was the oil shock really crucial? Or were there fundamental things going on with fiscal and monetary policy at the time that made the oil shock, that created the environment in which the oil shock could start producing the effects that it did? But nonetheless, the oil shock is something we have to discuss. It was a rise in a very important price, and it generated a lot of literature on how a shock to such an apparently small proportion of the total GDP in the U.S. could have such a huge effect on the rate of inflation, which I'll have to discuss. And I don't deny that it's interesting to discuss that.
Very much. Let me